To understand the birth of the Komsomolets, you must first understand the texture of the fear that gripped the Soviet High Command in the late 1970s. The Cold War was not a static standoff, it was a technological race, and by 1978, the Soviet Union knew it was losing the most critical leg of the marathon, the acoustic war. The North Atlantic is not an open ocean. Strategically, it is a funnel. For a Soviet submarine to threaten the American East Coast, it had to pass through the Greenland-Iceland-UK gap, known as the Giuk Gap. This stretch of water was the most surveilled real estate on planet Earth. The Americans had wired the ocean floor with SOSUS valence system, chains of hydrophones that listened to the deep, like a doctor listening to a heartbeat. The Soviet submarines of the era, the Victor and Charlie classes, were formidable, but they were loud. To the sensitive ears of SOSUS, a Soviet sub entering the Atlantic sounded like a freight train crossing a metal bridge. The Rubin Design Bureau, led by the legendary engineer Igor Spassky, faced an existential crisis. If they could not make their ships quieter than the background noise of the ocean, their nuclear deterrent was worthless. The Americans relied on stealth through silence. They built ships with tighter tolerances, better bearings, and quieter pumps. The Soviets, lacking the precision milling technology of the West, could not compete on silence alone. They needed a different kind of stealth. They needed stealth through exclusion. They needed to go where the physics of sound and the physics of weapons stopped working. The ocean is stratified. It has layers. Sound travels differently at different depths and temperatures. But more importantly, weapons have hard limits. A torpedo is a machine, it has a crush depth. A sonar system is a machine, it has a range limit limited by density. The Rubin Bureau conceived of a bastion strategy turned on its head. Instead of staying close to home, they would build a ship that could penetrate the Atlantic by diving beneath the battlefield. They called it Project 685. It was to be a laboratory ship, a test bed for the fourth generation of nuclear submarines. But as the design evolved, it became something more. It became a national obsession. The engineers weren't just told to build a deep-diving sub, they were told to build a ship that was invulnerable. They looked to the history of the bathyscaphe, they looked to the science of titanium, and they decided to weld a pressure hull that would require the entire industrial output of the Soviet titanium industry. This was not just military engineering, it was economic madness. But in the logic of the Cold War, madness was a prerequisite for survival. This prologue sets the stage for the tragedy. The Komsomolets was born out of fear, the fear of American silence. It was a machine built to answer a strategic question with brute force physics. But as the crew of the K-278 would discover, you can engineer a hull to survive the ocean, but you cannot engineer a system to survive human error. In the final, paranoid chessboard maneuvers of the Cold War, the Soviet Union built a ghost. It was a submarine designed around a single, terrifying premise, total weapon immunity. The American Navy, with its Los Angeles-class attack submarines, had mastered the art of acoustic stealth. American ships whispered. They were ghosts in the machine of the ocean. The Soviets responded by building a ship that could hide in the basement of the ocean. They built a vessel capable of diving to an operational depth of 1,027 meters, or 3,370 feet. This wasn't just a record-breaking number for the Guinness Book of World Records, it was a tactical checkmate. At that depth, the rules of naval engagement don't just bend, they break. Consider the physics of the kill. The standard U.S. Navy torpedo, the Mark 48, creates thrust by burning Otto fuel II. It is an engine that needs to breathe. To generate thrust, the torpedo must vent exhaust gases into the water. In the upper ocean, this is simple, but at 1,000 meters, the water pressure is roughly 1,460 pounds per square inch. In scientific terms, the pressure P dollars at that depth is roughly 100 atmospheres. The ocean is no longer just water, it is a hydraulic press attempting to crush anything hollow. For a torpedo, this creates a phenomenon known as back pressure stalling. The engine has to work twice as hard just to push the exhaust gases out of the tailpipe against the crushing weight of the sea. The deeper the torpedo goes, the less power is available for thrust. The engine doesn't just lose speed, it suffocates. The Soviet engineers realized that if the Komsomolets could dive deep enough, she wouldn't have to outrun the torpedo. She would simply drown the torpedo's engine. If a Los Angeles-class sub fired at them, the Komsomolets would simply tilt her nose down and dive. The torpedo would have to follow it down, burning energy, straining its guidance sensors, and losing speed. The Komsomolets was the only ship in history that could outdive the probability of a kill, but to build a ship that could survive, where weapons failed, required a material that defied conventional metallurgy. Steel, the backbone of naval construction for a century, was insufficient. Steel is heavy. To build a pressure hull capable of surviving 1,000 meters using steel, the plates would have to be so thick that the submarine's performance and buoyancy would collapse. It would be a sinking stone, not a warship. So, they returned to titanium. Specifically, the pressure hull, the inner cylinder that keeps the crew alive, was forged from a specialized alloy known as 48T. Post-Cold War analysis suggests the 48T alloy offered a yield strength of roughly 720 megapascals, $73 text kg/mm 2-nuke. This is a massive leap over standard naval steel, 80, which yields at roughly 550 MPa. This high strength-to-weight ratio allowed the Komsomolets to withstand 100 atmospheres of pressure while maintaining a 30% reserve buoyancy, a figure unheard of in Western designs, but building it was an industrial nightmare. The Soviets had tried this before with the Project 661 Anchor Nano, Papa Kas, known as the Golden Fish because of its exorbitant cost. The Golden Fish was a disaster of fabrication. Titanium has a critical weakness. At high temperatures, it absorbs hydrogen and oxygen, becoming brittle. If you weld titanium in the presence of air, the weld cracks before it cools. For Project 685, the Sevmash shipyard in Severodvinsk became a fortress of argon gas. The welding halls were transformed. Workers wore full-body positive pressure suits, looking more like cosmonauts than shipwrights. They labored inside sealed chambers filled with pure argon to create an inert atmosphere. Every weld was an act of chemical perfection. The cost was prohibitive. While exact figures are lost to Soviet secrecy, it is widely accepted that K-278 was one of the most expensive naval vessels ever constructed. It was so expensive that the Soviets never built another one. The K-278 was a unicorn, the only ship of her class. But for that money, they got a masterpiece. She was fast, deep, and heavily automated. Conventional Soviet subs carried over 100 men. The Komsomolets was run by a crew of just 69. She was covered in a specialized anechoic skin. The hull was coated with 50mm thick rubberized tiles. Unlike the smooth tiles of earlier generations, these tiles contained internal voids tuned to specific frequencies. They absorbed active sonar pings from NATO ships and dampened the noise of the submarine's own machinery. She wasn't as quiet as an American boat, but she didn't need to be. She was the titanium Icarus, flying safely beneath the reach of her enemies. She was the Mike class. And on April 7, 1989, she would prove that engineering brilliance is no match for chemical failure. The design philosophy of the Komsomolets represented the absolute zenith of Soviet naval ambition. It was not merely a vessel, it was an ideological statement. It said, "We may not have your microchips, but we have better metallurgy. We have better physics." But in their quest for the ultimate hull, they neglected the soft underbelly of the machine, the internal safety systems. They built a hull that could survive the apocalypse, but filled it with systems that couldn't survive a single spark. The Komsomolets wasn't a science experiment. She was a hunter. On her final patrol in April 1989, she was fully armed for World War III. Her magazine contained a terrifying mix of weapons. She carried the RPK-2 Vyuga NATO, Starfosh, an anti-submarine nuclear-tipped missile designed to destroy American subs from long range. Even more critically, she carried 2 heavyweight torpedoes tipped with plutonium-239 warheads. This loadout raises the stakes of the story. When the fire started, the crew wasn't just fighting for their lives. They were fighting to prevent a nuclear incident that could create a multi-generational environmental disaster in the rich fishing grounds of the Norwegian Sea. The ship was perfect. The hull was perfect. The weapons were perfect. But inside the titanium shell, there was a flaw. A flaw not in the metal, but in the chemistry. April 7, 1989. 11 a.m. The Komsomolets is cruising at a depth of 386 meters. She is returning from her first operational patrol. The mood on board is relaxed. Lunch is being served in the mess hall. In the command center, compartment 3, Captain Evgeny Vanin is on duty. He is confident. He is commanding the finest ship in the Soviet Navy. But 60 meters behind him, in the tail of the ship, a disaster is being born. Compartment 7, the tiller room. This is the lonely end of the ship. It houses the massive hydraulic steering gears that move the rudder. It is occupied by a single man, Seaman Nadari Buknikashvili. It is his 21st birthday. At 11:03 a.m., a warning light flickers on the main damage control panel in the command center. Temperature high. Compartment 7. Captain Vanin calls Buknikashvili on the intercom. Report. The voice that comes back is frantic. Fire. There is smoke. I am... The line goes dead. Forensic analysis later determined that a short circuit occurred in an electrical bus panel. In a normal room, this would be a small fire. But this was a high-pressure environment. A hydraulic line had likely sprung a micro-leak, filling the compartment with an atomized mist of oil. The spark didn't just light a puddle, it ignited an aerosol. A flash fire erupted. The air itself became fuel. Buknikashvili tried to fight it. But he was standing inside a fuel air bomb. And then, the fire found the one thing that would turn a kitchen grease fire into a plasma cutter. Running through the ceiling of Compartment 7 was a main line for the high-pressure air system. Submarines carry massive tanks of compressed air to blow their ballast tanks and surface during an emergency. This air is stored at 400 atmospheres, approximately 5,800 psi. To put that in perspective, a car tire is 30 psi. This pipe held pressure 200 times greater. The fire heated the pipe. The metal softened. The pressure inside was too much. 11:05 a.m. The HPA line ruptured. When a 400-atmosphere airline ruptures, it does not just leak. It acts as a gas dynamic jet. A massive volume of oxygen-rich air is injected into the fire at supersonic velocity. This creates a forced draft furnace effect. The temperature in Compartment 7 didn't just rise, it spiked. Within seconds, the temperature exceeded 1,000 C. It was no longer a fire, it was a blowtorch. The intense heat vaporized everything. The hydraulic fluid lines burst, adding fuel to the jet. The aluminum ladders melted. And terrifyingly, the heat was so intense that it began to affect the pressure hull itself. On the outside of the submarine, the cold ocean water began to boil against the titanium skin. The anechoic coating, the rubber tiles glued to the hull, melted. They peeled off in sheets, leaving the bare metal exposed. Inside Compartment 7, Seaman Nadari Buknikashvili didn't stand a chance. He was incinerated instantly. In Compartment 3, Captain Vanin watched the temperature gauge's redline. He knew he had to act. The standard procedure for a compartment fire is LOCR, the Boat Volume Chemical Fire Extinguishing System. This system floods the compartment with Freon 114b2. Freon 114b2 is a heavy gas. It works chemically by inhibiting the chain reaction of combustion. It displaces oxygen and smothers the flame. It is highly effective, but it is lethal to humans in high concentrations. Vannin faced a moral nightmare. He knew Buknikashvili was in there. If he triggered the Freon, he would be executing his own crewmen. He yelled into the intercom again. "Nadari, report." Silence. Vannin made the hard choice. He prioritized the ship. He turned the key. Activate locker. Compartment 7. But physics had a surprise for him. The Freon system relies on gravity and moderate pressure to dump the gas into the room. But remember the Hope line? The ruptured air line was pumping 400 atmospheres of pressure into compartment 7. The room was pressurized like a balloon. The Freon couldn't get in. The internal pressure of the fire was higher than the pressure of the extinguisher. The fire suppression failed. Worse, the high pressure forced the toxic smoke and fire out of compartment 7. It blasted through the cable penetrations. It melted the seals on the watertight bulkhead. The fire jumped. 11:21 a.m. The alarm sounded for compartment 6, the turbine hall. The fire was moving forward. It was eating the ship from the tail up. Compartment 6 housed the massive steam turbines and the main hydraulic pumps. As the fire consumed compartment 6, it melted the hydraulic lines. The pressure in the ship's control systems dropped to zero. The stern planes, the flaps that control the submarine's angle, jammed. Vannin realized the ship was dying. If he stayed at 380 meters, they would burn to death or implode. He ordered an emergency ballast blow. Blow all main ballast tanks. High-pressure air from the surviving forward banks roared into the ballast tanks, forcing the water out. The 8,000-ton Titan rocketed toward the surface. It breached the water like a whale splashing down in the rough seas of the Norwegian Sea. This moment, the decision to blow the tanks, is a critical pivot point. Had Vannin known the true extent of the damage to the high-pressure air system, he might have hesitated. But he was operating on limited information. He knew the stern was burning. He knew the controls were dead. His instinct was survival. Get to the surface. Get to the air. It was a logical decision, but in the twisted logic of this disaster, it was the decision that would ultimately doom the ship. 16 a.m. The Komsomolets is on the surface. The crew cheered. They opened the hatch in the sail. Fresh, cold air rushed in. They thought they had survived. They believed they had beaten the odds. They were wrong. Surfacing didn't put out the fire. It made it worse. This is where the tragedy shifts from an operational accident to a cascading failure of systems. By surfacing, the hull expanded slightly as the external pressure was removed. Microcracks opened. But the real killer was the airflow. When you open the hatches to breathe, you create a chimney. The fire in the stern was hot, creating a massive updraft. This updraft sucked fresh, oxygen-rich air down through the main hatch and into the ventilation system. The fire, which had been choking on its own smoke, took a deep breath. And waiting in the heart of the fire in compartment 6 were the ticking time bombs that no one had thought about. The Komsomolets used a chemical system to generate oxygen, known as the V-64 Air Vitalization Units. A submarine is a sealed bottle. You have to make your own air. These units rely on canisters filled with potassium superoxide, KO2. Is a brilliant piece of chemistry. When you exhale carbon dioxide, these canisters absorb it and release pure oxygen O2, 4KO2 plus 2CO2 to 2K2CO3 plus 3O2. But potassium superoxide is a potent oxidizer. At normal temperatures, these canisters are stable, but in the 1,000 C heat of the turbine hall fire, the steel casings of the V-64 units lost their structural integrity. They burst. The rupture dumped pure oxygen into a room filled with burning oil mist. It wasn't a chemical detonation of the salt itself, it was a flashover. The sudden spike in oxygen concentration catalyzed the fire instantly. It acted like a supercharger. The fire didn't just burn, it turned into a thermal runaway event. Around 12 p.m., survivors on the deck felt the ship shudder. They heard dull booms echoing from deep inside the hull. The oxygen generators were exploding one by one. Each failure acted like a fuel air bomb. The fire grew so hot that it didn't just melt plastic. It began to attack the metal infrastructure of the ship. The K-278 was designed to withstand 100 atmospheres of pressure from the outside, but it wasn't designed to withstand 1,000 on the inside. The titanium hull itself, the 48T alloy, has a melting point of over 1,600 C. The hull didn't melt, but the penetrations did. A submarine is full of holes. Thousands of cables, pipes, and hydraulic lines have to pass through the pressure hull to reach the outside world. To make them watertight, they are sealed with specialized rubber and plastic gaskets called cable glands. The fire vaporized these seals. Suddenly, the watertight hull was full of Swiss cheese holes. In compartment 7, the fire had burned through the seals on the main ballast tank vents. With the seals destroyed, the compressed air holding the water out of the ballast tanks vented into the fire. The ballast tanks flooded. The stern of the submarine began to lose buoyancy. It got heavy. On the surface, the crew noticed a terrifying change. The submarine wasn't level anymore. The bottom was sinking. The bow was rising. The ocean was coming back. For 5 agonizing hours, the Komsomolets fought to stay afloat. It was a slow-motion car crash. Inside, the crew fought a losing battle. The toxic smoke, a mixture of burning oil, melted rubber, and lethal carbon monoxide, spread through the ventilation system. Even men in the forward compartments far from the fire began to drop. Their independent breathing apparatus, IP46 masks, were running out of chemical cartridges. Carbon monoxide CO is an insidious killer. It binds to hemoglobin 200 times more effectively than oxygen. The crewmen began to feel dizzy, confused. Their movements slowed. They were dying of hypoxia while breathing. Captain Vannon climbed to the bridge. He ordered the radio operator to send a distress signal. Mayday. Mayday. Fire in aft compartments. Request assistance. The signal was picked up by Soviet command. Rescue planes, IL-38s, were scrambled. A fishing factory ship, the Alexei Klobistov, turned toward the coordinates. But the Klobistov was hours away. Inside the control room, the situation was becoming critical. The heat from the aft compartments was conducting through the metal bulkheads. The paint on the walls in compartment 5 began to blister. The men were fighting a fire that was literally melting the ship around them. The crew on the deck watched in horror as the heat became visible. The specialized rubber tiles on the outer hull began to smoke. The titanium skin of the submarine, normally a dull gray, began to change color due to the intense internal heat. It was a terrifying visual confirmation of the inferno raging beneath their feet. The ship was not just sinking, it was cooking. Survivors recount a surreal scene. The weather was relatively calm, but the ship was enveloped in a cloud of acrid black smoke. Men were coughing, their faces blackened by soot. They huddled near the sail, the highest point of the ship, as the stern slowly, inexorably, slid beneath the waves. They were witnessing the death of a titan, but their minds were occupied with the petty, freezing details of survival. Where is the raft? Is the radio working? Why is the water so cold? At 4:30 p.m., the stern dipped below the water. The angle of the deck increased. The ocean lapped over the tail fins. At 5 p.m., the water reached the base of the sail. The Komsomolets was 6,000 tons of titanium. Once it lost buoyancy, it wanted to go to the bottom. And the bottom was 1,680 meters down. Vannon gave the order. Abandon ship. But it was too late for life rafts. The ship was tilting vertically. Men were sliding down the icy hull into the freezing water. The water temperature was 2 Celsius. Without immersion suits, survival time is measured in minutes, not hours. And Captain Vannon, he didn't jump. He was on the bridge, ready to evacuate. But he looked back down the hatch. He heard voices over the intercom. There were men still trapped inside the central control compartment. In a moment of supreme heroism or madness, Captain Vannon left the safety of the open air. He climbed back down the ladder into the sinking ship. He went back to find his men. He sealed the hatch above him. He was going to try to use the secret weapon of Project 685, the Vizisk escape capsule. 08 p.m. The Komsomolets is gone. The ocean has swallowed 6,000 tons of titanium, a nuclear reactor, and 2 nuclear warheads. On the surface, survivors are struggling in the freezing 2-degree water. Many will die of hypothermia before the rescue ships arrive. The Alexei Klobostov is still steaming toward them, but the clock is ticking. But the drama isn't over. It is continuing underwater. Inside the sinking hull, Captain Evgeny Vannon is not dead. He has gathered the trapped men. Captain Third Rank Ispenkov, who had stayed to keep the generators running to the very end, Warrant Officer Slyusarenko, and 2 others. They scrambled into the Vizisk escape capsule. Embedded in the sail of the submarine was a detachable titanium pod. It was a lifeboat integrated into the structure of the ship. It was designed to hold the entire crew. It had its own air supply. It was held in place by explosive bolts. Vannon and the 4 men sealed the bottom hatch, isolating themselves from the flooding submarine. They were now sitting inside a bubble, attached to a rock falling into the abyss. Vannon pulled the release lever. Nothing happened. The Vizisk didn't separate. The explosive bolts failed to fire, or perhaps the intense heat of the fire had warped the titanium hull, jamming the mechanical latches. They continued to fall. The depth gauge spun. 400 meters, 600 meters, 1,000 meters. They passed the immunity zone. They were heading for the crush depth. Inside the capsule, the air was becoming toxic. Smoke from the fire had leaked in before they sealed the hatch. The men were coughing, dizzy from carbon monoxide. Ispenkov, exhausted from his battle with the generators, lost consciousness. The pressure outside was climbing. 120 atmospheres, 140 atmospheres. The titanium walls of the capsule groaned. This descent was a journey into the heart of terror. Imagine the sensory deprivation. The capsule is dark, lit only by emergency battery lights. The air is thick with smoke. Outside, the ocean is pressing in with the weight of a freight train on every square inch. And they are falling. Falling past the depth where American torpedoes fail. Falling past the depth where sunlight penetrates. Falling toward the abyssal plain. They are trapped in a coffin that was supposed to be a lifeboat. Then, at roughly 1,600 meters, a depth that would crush a normal submarine like a soda can, physics intervened. It wasn't just the water pressure, it was the chemistry in the bow. The massive silver-zinc batteries had been discharging wildly during the fire, shorting out in the salt water. This process, electrolysis, splits water into oxygen and hydrogen. The torpedo room filled with hydrogen gas. At 1,600 meters, a spark ignited it. The hydrogen detonated. A massive internal explosion ripped through the forward compartments. The shock wave traveled down the titanium spine of the ship, hitting the sail like a hammer. The vibration shattered the friction locks holding the capsule. The ship died, but in its death throes, the shock wave hammered the capsule free. The Vizisk was positively buoyant. Once it was free of the heavy submarine, it didn't just float up, it rocketed up. It shot from 1,600 meters to the surface in seconds. But this speed was fatal. As the capsule rose, the pressure outside dropped from 160 atmospheres to 1 atmosphere. But inside the capsule, the pressure was high. The capsule had been leaking while it was attached to the sinking ship. It had equalized with the deep ocean pressure. When the Vizisk breached the surface, it was like a shaken champagne bottle. The pressure differential was catastrophic. The moment the capsule broke the surface, the internal pressure blew the top hatch open. It wasn't just a pop. The hatch was ejected with the force of a cannon. The explosion ejected Warrant Officer Slyusarenko out of the capsule and into the sea. He was thrown clear. He was the only one who got out alive. The capsule, now open to the rough seas, lost its buoyancy instantly. A massive wave washed over the open hatch. Water poured in. Captain Vannon, disoriented by the gas and the sudden decompression, couldn't get out. He shouted something, but the roar of the ocean drowned him out. The Vitsk, having traveled all the way from the bottom of the ocean to save them, sank back down. It took Captain Vannon back to the darkness. The Vitsk rests today on the bottom of the Norwegian Sea, just a few hundred meters from the main wreck. It is the tomb of the man who tried to save his ship. On the surface, the Alexei Klobostov finally arrived. They pulled 30 survivors from the water. But 39 men were dead. Some burned, some drowned, some frozen. The rescue scene was chaotic and heartbreaking. The survivors, soaked in oil and freezing water, were hauled onto the deck of the fishing ship. They were shivering violently, their bodies in shock. They watched the empty ocean where their technological marvel had been just hours before. The unsinkable ship, the pride of the Soviet Navy, was gone. And with it, 42 of their comrades. Today, the Komsomolets is not a warship. It is an environmental disaster waiting to happen. The wreck sits at 1,680 meters. Inside the crushed hull are two things that keep Norwegian scientists awake at night. The OK-650B3 nuclear core contains a massive amount of uranium-235 and fission byproducts like cesium-137. In 2019, a joint Norwegian-Russian expedition sent a remotely operated vehicle down to the wreck. They filmed a pulsing cloud of silt coming out of a ventilation pipe near the reactor. They took a sample. Localized sampling directly in the plume showed cesium-137 levels 800,000 times more than normal seawater. The reactor containment has been breached. While the ocean dilutes this quickly, the core is leaking directly into the environment. The warheads. Even scarier are the two nuclear torpedoes in the bow. They contain plutonium-239. Plutonium is a heavy metal. It is chemically toxic and highly radioactive. It has a half-life of 24,000 years. The danger here is a matter of basic electrochemistry. The titanium hull is a noble metal. It does not corrode. But the casings of the torpedoes are made of steel. This creates a galvanic battery. It is a basic law of electrochemistry. When you connect titanium and steel in salt water, the electrolyte, you create a circuit. Electrons flow from the steel to the titanium. The steel sacrifices itself, corroding at a massively accelerated rate. Fe to Phi +2 + 2e. The submarine's own hull is eating the torpedo casings. When those casings fail, the plutonium will spill into the sediment, creating a long-term environmental hazard in one of the world's most vital fishing grounds. In the 1990s, the Russians launched Project Jellyfish. They tried to seal the holes in the torpedo tubes with titanium caps and gelatin bags to stop the flow of water. But the 2019 footage shows the seals are failing. The Komsomolets is slowly bleeding into the barren sea. The death of the Komsomolets did not end when the ship hit the bottom. It continued in the courtrooms and the closed-door inquiries of the crumbling Soviet Empire. When the survivors returned to shore, they were not greeted as heroes. They were greeted as suspects. The Soviet Navy, embarrassed by the loss of their most advanced ship, looked for a scapegoat. The investigation that followed was a forensic dismemberment of the crew's actions. The naval inquiry focused intensely on Compartment 7. They blamed Seaman Buknikashvili for the initial fire, suggesting he might have been smoking or using a heater, charges that were vehemently denied by his family and later disproven by forensic modeling of the electrical bus. They blamed Captain Vannon for the delay in surfacing. They blamed the crew for failing to use the Freon system correctly, but the inquiry conveniently ignored the structural failures. They ignored the fact that the crew's independent breathing apparatus RIP-46 masks were prone to failure in high heat. They ignored the fact that the oxygen generators were placed directly in the line of fire. They ignored the fact that the VSISC escape capsule, the ultimate safety net, had failed to separate until it was blasted free by an explosion. The most damning piece of evidence came from the layout of the ship itself. The Komsomolets was highly automated to reduce crew size. This was seen as a strength. But in a fire, automation is a weakness. A computer cannot smell smoke. A computer cannot grab a fire extinguisher. By the time the automated sensors triggered the alarm, the fire in Compartment 7 was already an inferno. The reduced crew meant there were no men in the aft compartments to spot the leak early. The ghost was too empty. The controversy over the Komsomolets accelerated the fall of the Soviet Navy. It revealed that for all their titanium and nuclear might, their damage control culture was broken. It was a catalyst for the chaotic decline of the 1990s, where submarines rotted at their docks, their reactors cooling, their crews unpaid. Today, there is a memorial to the crew of the Komsomolets. But the true memorial is the wreck itself. It lies in the darkness, a monument to a specific moment in human history where we believed we could conquer the abyss with metal. The Komsomolets remains a clockwork orange of the deep. The clock is the corrosion rate of the torpedo casings. Every year, the salt water chews a little deeper into the steel. Every year, the plutonium gets a little closer to the open water. The Norwegian Radiation and Nuclear Safety Authority monitors the site religiously. They know that the Komsomolets is not dead. She is merely sleeping. And like the dragon in the fairy tale, if she wakes, if that plutonium spills, she will burn the village one last time. The story of the Titanium Icarus ends not with a period, but with a question mark. We built a ship to be immune to weapons, and in doing so, we built a weapon that is immune to time. The Komsomolets is still down there, waiting, the final and most enduring ghost of the Cold War.